At this point, we are less than a week and a half away from the release of the Prepatch of Midnight. So what we're doing for today is updating our Doomer status in our UI, because what comes with the Prepatch is what will come with Midnight, but it comes even earlier now, is the removal of the functionality of many combat add-ons, namely things like weak auras, things like Nameplate add-on, things like Cell and general party and raid frame add-ons. Many of these things are gonna die in about 10 days. So obviously the attention now goes in what has Blizzard been cooking to replace these add-ons that are now going to the graveyard. Actually no, Blizzard isn't even burying them, they actually brought them back and shot them in the back of the head like pigs. But what we're looking at for today is essentially what do we have left still to complain about these new added features from Blizzard to replace the add-ons. Obviously, as a PSA, don't expect to be able to have, even in your best case scenario, a full one-to-one conversion. But by default, you want to be able to be as happy with the new default UI as you were with your good, old, nostalgic, curated, long-lasting add-ons. That's not gonna happen. You will feel worse anyways. But still, there's a difference going from a restaurant-level pizza to a frozen pizza to stale bread, right? We don't have to downgrade that much. So the one that is currently in its best state of the features added by Blizzard is the Cooldown Manager. Essentially, the replacement of your suite of spec buttons, spec procs, passives and buffs showing up in the center of your screen, generally speaking. That's the one that is looking and functioning somewhat the best of the new additions. You know, if you're looking at these clips, whenever I have videos on, they could kind of possibly pass for a weak aura package for the spec, right? They are somewhat reminiscent, somewhat working like one. They kind of look fine enough. Obviously, these are enhanced and prettified by add-ons on top of the Cooldown Manager, but they are still using the same functions, so it's still doing fine. The Cooldown Manager does still have issues. So the issue number one is that you still can't detach your essential big buttons and the utility smaller buttons from being a single clump. So whether you want 10 essential buttons in a row, or 2 rows of 5, or a row of 4 and then 2 smaller rows of 3, they still have to go together. You can't just move them around. If you look at this, for example, you're like, ha! Izen is cheating. He has just split the bars in different positions across the screen based on what he wants, right? This way you could do things like, maybe I could put, you know, mobility buttons here, defensive buttons here, or maybe, you know, smaller cooldown buttons I want to keep track of more closely here. No, the only reason why this is happening is because these are action bars. Action bar 6 and action bar 7, they are not actually part of the Cooldown Manager. That's currently what you have to do if you want to have these icons show up in anything other than multiple rows or a single row all clamped up together. The second annoyance of the Cooldown Manager would be the alerts, because even though they added alerts, even though you have the ability, for example, even for your main buttons to do things like adding an alert, either a sound, this is fine. Sound alerts are working just as you expect them, whether you want to activate them in these different conditions, it's fine enough. The visual is still terrible. The available visuals that Blizzard offers are all terrible, like this flash, for example, added to my Blessed Hammer when it comes off cooldown and it's available. You know, the flash that you're about to see is not very good. Even with the default Cooldown Manager and not an add-on, it's still very poor. You don't have a lot of way to customize these by yourself. Yes, you can get bailed out by add-ons once again to have better glows, for example, better flashing glows to show your abilities being available, for example, but the Cooldown Manager is definitely not doing a good job. The last part, it's a complaint that shouldn't have been a complaint, but it has been going on for quite a few weeks, actually months now, so it hasn't been fixed yet. The Cooldown Manager is still lacking some options for you to actually show at all. So whether we're talking about abilities or buffs or procs is still missing. For example, in terms of abilities, you still have no way of showing your racials. You still have no ways of showing your trinkets. Regardless of what trinket is going to be, it's not going to be available. Same goes when it comes to passives. There are quite a few passive effects, which are especially the ones tied to your new Apex talents and even some tied to your hero talents, which are not even an option available to your Cooldown Manager to show up as an icon. Very often these are going to be procs such as once every 20 seconds or once every 30 seconds, or procs on your next cast of a certain ability. Not all of these things are being tracked by the Cooldown Manager. I said it's not something that should have been mentioned because we thought, yeah, but this is easy, right? Blizzard just has to add these things into the Cooldown Manager. It's not that big of a problem. And then, you know, a week went by, 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, 2 months, it's still a problem. It still hasn't been adjusted in the Cooldown Manager. But all in all, the way it looks like now, plus beautified and prettified and quality of lifeified by add-ons, it's fine enough, the Cooldown Manager. Now, what is not fine whatsoever are the two next things we will have to live through once the Prepatch launches. First one is the nameplates. Again, even with the add-ons you can use for nameplates, they can't do miracles. So this is what you can have with nameplates, and a few of the things you can somewhat improve with the use of add-ons, but not changing the base problems these nameplates have, which is something we will hear about when going about frames, raid frames and party frames as well, which is the filtering. This is going to be the big no-no word of the expansion if things continue to go like this, because you have no way of filtering anything when it comes to plates. I always use this one because it's always the funnier example. Imagine you're a warlock, imagine you're affliction, imagine you're playing with absolute corruption, so your corruption is infinite, and now you have an icon of a dot which never ends attached to 15 mobs in a Mythic Plus pool. Why do you need to see an icon of 15 corruptions on 15 mobs if that corruption doesn't end? That corruption is endless. You just dump on the mobs a couple of seeds of corruptions, and now your corruption has been spread to the entire pack of enemies, and the corruption is endless. So you have zero need of wanting to see that extra mental load, that extra thing you have to see with your eyes on the frame of enemies, because it's not necessary. You have no ability to filter it out from your nameplates right now. That is at the moment the biggest annoyance. The second biggest annoyance of the nameplates, which we have gotten a very, very slight walk back on right now, is the coloring. The fact that essentially you cannot change the color of the health bars depending on individual mobs. You have gotten a slight improvement in the sense that now you're able to change them by default on type of enemy. So boss, mini-boss, caster, melee and trivial mob, they can be colored differently, but the entire category of those mobs, not the individual ones. Whereas cast bars, on the other hand, do not get that leeway. Cast bars have their own color, they only change color if it's a cast or a channel, and if it is an uninterruptible spell, which is also the same thing that the default Blizzard UI is already doing, and that's about it. We're not complaining about things we know are not gonna come back, because that's gonna be redundant, like complaining about, for example, the cooldown tracker, the ability you add on putting certain dangerous spells and their countdown, their cooldown next to certain trash mobs, for example, so you could see when a dangerous ability was coming. We know that's not coming back. We know Blizzard is not trying to bring that back anyway, so we're not gonna ask for it, but the lack of the filtering on nameplates is pretty bad, especially of course for dot heavy specs. The rest of the problems, as mentioned, the inability to properly change the health bar the color you want, or the cast bars the color you want, are also a problem, with the last problem being the name. We will see how much this will impact nameplates, but you cannot change names of enemies in any way, pretty much, which could become annoying, especially because names are going to be very often shortened on enemies, so it will be hard to detect who is what, who is casting what, and which mobs are what with all of these longer names, rather than simply shortening them, is also something we have not gotten a solution to for now when it comes to nameplates. But the last bigger of the problems for now is gonna be to your frames, your party and your raid frames. Funnily enough, for most of you it won't matter much if you're a DPS or even a tank who never even cared about looking at other players' frames. It's pointless, but it is at the moment pretty much a disaster for all healers. It is a disaster because right now very little has been done to these frames, very little improvements have been seen to the raid and party frames. You still have zero ways to order your buffs, for example, or your debuffs in different positions. So if you were used to putting, say, Dream Breath bottom right, Reversion top right, and then Lifebind top left, that's not going to be available in Midnight. which gets, again, progressively worse the more HOTS you have. Imagine being a Resto Druid. You have Reju, you have Germination, you have Regrowth Hot, you have Wild Growth, you have Life Bloom. They are all gonna be in a single row of 5, or maybe a row of 3 and then a row of 2, clogging half of the frame of a player, without any ability to either filter some of these you don't want to see, or simply move them in different positions. Same can be said for debuffs. For debuffs though, the problem isn't as much the number, because realistically speaking, if you're in a Mythic Plus key or in a raid, you're not gonna get like 4 or 5 debuffs on you. But this is the same problem we have had for nameplates. The filtering is gonna be the major issue. As a tradition, long-term tradition for most healers, one of the best things you can do when you start raiding and learning the bosses, learning the mechanics, what's the danger stuff? What do I need to pay attention to? You start filtering out the useless things, things that don't impact you too much. You don't want them to be in your mental load when you look at the frames. You don't want to be distracted by those things. For example, rot, damage, debuffs. Many bosses nowadays, in fact almost all bosses, have this generic aura that makes you take damage. Quite a few times these generic auras are also debuffs on you that just, take for 10% or 5% of your HP every 2 seconds or something, and those show up in the frames. Now, it's pretty demonic to imagine raiding and seeing this debuff active on 20 players for the entire fight. It's completely useless. You know it's there. The entire raid is taking that damage. It's a raid-wide dot that lasts forever. You don't want to see it. You can't not see it in Midnight because you have no way to filter it out. The same way could be for example, because this is a mechanic that happens very, very often, soak mechanics. Very often Blizzard will have soak mechanics that will put a debuff on players, so they are limited from being able to soak again for a certain period of time. So you have to make different groups to soak, right? That will show up as a debuff. You, of course, don't care about it. You are a raid, you are coordinated, you know that group 1 soaks the first thing, group 2 soaks the second, or whatever. You don't need to see the debuff of I have just soaked on a player for 45 seconds. That is completely pointless, clogs up your player frames for no reason, and again, in Midnight you have no way to filter them out. So the clutter, as of right now, in both party and raid frames is horrible. Both when it comes from your inability to filter out debuffs you don't want to see, as well as the inability to filter out debuffs you don't want to see. We are lacking any kind of these features, which would be very well liked. Obviously then we could also complain about other things, like what about things like these, right? Being able to add buffs in the form of overlays would also be very good, or buffs in the form of, corner little square colors or bars at the top of the frame, these kind of changes that are not simply just icons on a frame, something more than just icons. That is also something that would be great when it comes to customizing your raid and party frames. But before we even get to that, before we even get to complain that far forward, the inability to filter buffs and debuffs is the biggest issue right now when it comes to your frames. And we are going to do it. We are going to use the effort again when it comes to the raid ability timeline, the boss ability timeline. So, introduced by Blizzard to replace DBM or replace bigwigs, now you're gonna have a drop-down list of essentially mechanics of an encounter. It's gonna come up, whether it is in an add-on version or the default Blizzard version, it's gonna look like this. You can, work in the future and add the big icon at the bottom as well, but the result will look like this regardless, because you have no way of customizing this. The F word, again, is filtering. You don't have a way to choose what do you want to see here. Every single one of these things will show up, regardless of what it is. Is it the Berserk in 7 minutes? Doesn't matter. Is it a tank buster? You don't care as a DPS? It's gonna show up. Is it a healer dispel mechanic as a tank? It's gonna show up. Doesn't matter. This is all gonna show up and you have no way of customizing any of this. You have no extra options. So that's the other big problem when it comes to cluttering your vision, your mental capacity, how much you can take from the center of your screen. This is also going to be taking up a decent portion of it, because it's gonna clutter you with irrelevant information you don't care about. So we had, even here, yes, to go and mention the banned word again. There's a big filtering problem in the boss ability timeline as well. as we need to have some sort of way to allow us to choose what we want to see. Remember, this entire movement was started by Blizzard under the assumption that this was going to give them an easier time to develop bosses. It was going to make them less of an arms race between them and top guilds, less and not as complicated and convoluted mechanics because they had to try to circumvent how powerful add-ons have become. I don't think allowing Arresto Druid to put their Reju bottom left instead of bottom right by itself is against this philosophy. I don't think allowing a warlock to not show its infinite corruption on the nameplate of enemies is gonna somehow go against this idea that Blizzard has. The problem is that right now all of these annoyances we have mentioned seem like a collateral victim, seem collateral damage to the changes, because obviously you can't put a filtering system in game, because if you put a filtering system in game, it means you can parse the API of Blizzard for spell IDs, and if you can parse the API of Blizzard for spell IDs, other add-ons like pseudo Wikora add-ons could start parsing spell IDs to start making the Wikoras Blizzard don't want you to have. Not the ones that can allow you to move around your Reju or allow you to filter some debuff on enemy nameplates, but more so the kind of Wikoras that can make you show incoming casts in your frames, the CDs of offensive and defensive or even crowd control abilities on all players like Omni CC, Wikoras to solve complex mechanics in the raid, etc, etc. That's why it's unlikely for us to be getting any kind of filtering system anytime soon. We hope, that's the last hope. The last hope is for Blizzard to somehow be able to lessen this restriction with add-ons. So not add them in-game, not add this system in-game themselves, but somehow allow a way for add-ons to allow you to filter some of these things in your frames. Especially when it comes to, at the very least, not show something. Because showing extra things could be a problem, but not showing certain things shouldn't be a problem, even in Blizzard's minds. So we hope to be getting at the very least there between the release of the pre-patch and the release of the expansion. Because for now, these are the issues that are going to come out once pre-patch comes. We haven't gotten any new recent changes for the UI of Midnight. Hopefully, between the release of pre-patch and over a month and the release of the actual expansion, we will get some extra improvements to the whole of the UI. But for now, this is the state of the current Blizzard UI coming in the pre-patch, and these were also the bigger problems we are currently expecting going from our current loved add-ons to the Blizzard home-cooked version of them. So, for today, this is what we had to talk about on this Sunday. We can now leave each other for now. I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. And with this, we're saying our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, we're getting there. I can feel the voice starting to crackle away, but we kind of got to the finish line.